Well, I want to welcome you to the Ark Encounter, and as people just get off the bus, they come right through here through this rainbow arch, and of course the rainbow is a reminder of God's promise that He would never again destroy the earth with a worldwide flood.
So this is our first opportunity to see the Ark, the whole picture.
Yep. Yeah, you can see it a little bit from the parking lot, but just from a distance. But this is the first time you get to see just how big it is.
Yeah.
So the Bible tells us that in Genesis 1, God created a perfect world. And He did that over the span of 6 days, and then He rested on the seventh day. And that original world, there was no death, no disease, no bloodshed. It truly was perfect, and yet we know that Adam and Eve rebelled. The first man and woman rebelled against God. That brought death and suffering, disease into this world. And that's what we depict on these monuments that we call monument walks. So this is leading up to the flood narrative in Scripture.
Okay, so this monument, they represent creation.
Yes, we see Adam being made from the dust of the ground, like the Bible talks about, Eve being made from his side, from his rib, and then God bringing them together, that first marriage, that was originally perfection. And then we're going to see what happened after that. The serpent comes along and deceives the woman, and she eats the fruit she gives to Adam, and he eats the fruit. And as a result, death and suffering and disease enter the world. So that's what these monuments represent. And then the Bible tells us that they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and they weren't allowed to return to it. And then they started to multiply and fill the earth, and people became worse and worse and worse. In fact, Adam and Eve's children, Cain, their first son kills Abel, one of their other sons. And that's what we depict here. And so the world becomes so filled with violence over the next 10 generations till you get to a guy named Noah. And
so between Adam and Noah, there are 10 generations.
10 generations. And now at that time, people were living a lot longer.
Yeah, and for how long they lived at that time?
So Noah lived to 950 years, Adam was 930. And so of the people that are named, most of them lived over 900 years. Or the people that are mentioned, how long they lived.
What was different in terms of conditions of the earth or human body that made it possible to live as long?
So there's a few different ideas about that. One would be that the further and further back you go, closer to Adam, the fewer genetic mistakes we would have. Because each generation you get what's called genetic load. You get more and more genetic copying errors in our genome. So it could be a result of genetic breakdown among humanity. The other possibility is in Genesis 6:3. The Bible, beginning in Genesis 6, it describes a lot of wickedness that's taking place in the earth just before the flood. And in verse 3, God says, "My spirit will not strive or dwell with man forever. He is indeed flesh. His days shall be 120 years." So some Christians think that what God is doing is reducing man's lifespan so that he cannot become as wicked as he's been.
So can it be that God actually adjusts or makes something into the DNA that shortens life?
Yeah, He can do that. He can use a natural process to perform His function, His goal. Just like when He parts the Red Sea for the Israelites to cross through, it says a strong east wind blew all that night and created that passage for them to go through the Red Sea. So He can use natural means to accomplish a supernatural purpose.
How much you think it was an effect within the man himself, or DNA, or the environment, which causes that?
So there are some creationists who think it had more to do with environment, that originally that first, the earth was a much greater place to live, and that there would have been, the environment itself would not have been as destructive as what we see today. That's not really our position as a ministry, even though we do think originally it was perfect, but it's not that. We don't think that the oxygen and the radiation, all that would have been very different after the fall to what it is today. So anyways, the world becomes, well, we'll head down this way. So the world becomes so filled with violence that God says he's going to judge it with a global flood. And so he tells Noah, who's a righteous man, that I want you to build this ark, and he gives the dimensions of how big it's going to be. And it's going to be for Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and their sons' wives. And then he says that he's going to send 2 of each of the animal kinds, and we learn in chapter 7 of Genesis that there's going to be 7 pairs of each of the clean animals and the flying creatures. So God sends those animals to Noah so that they go on board the ark. So when people say, how could he find all the animals? He didn't have to find the animals because God brought the animals to him. That's what Genesis 6:20 tells us. So we built our ark to the dimensions given in Scripture. Now, the Bible tells us that Noah was supposed to build it 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. Well, a cubit is this measurement. Which cubit did they use? If they use yours, it's going to be shorter than mine because mine's much longer. So we're not really sure which cubit they used. So what we did is we took one of the shortest of what's called a common cubit, which is about 17.5 inches that we find in the ancient Near East. And then what we noticed is a lot of major building projects like pyramids and temples were built on what's called a long cubit or a royal cubit, where they would add the width of 4 fingers to the cubit. And so we added 2.9 inches to give us a royal cubit or a long cubit of 20.4 inches. And so when we did that, that means our ark is 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet tall. And then we built it with 3 levels that guests can walk through, because the Bible tells us that Noah was supposed to build it with 3 decks and to have a door on its side. So this is, as far as we know, it's not an exact replica of Noah's Ark because we don't have all the details that we would need, but we do incorporate.
So all the details that we have is just outside measurements.
Outside measurement, and then 3 levels. Yep. And it tells us what kind of wood Noah was supposed to use, gopher wood, but we don't know what that is. It only appears one time in the Bible in Genesis 6:14. So we can't be sure. What we used is, on the exterior, we used radiata pine from New Zealand. And then the interior, we have like these large squared timbers you see there, those are Douglas fir. And then we also have these huge round, we call them lodge poles, but those are Engelmann spruce from out west. And then we actually walk around on bamboo flooring. So we've got 4 major types of timber used in the ark. All right, well, welcome to the Ark Encounter. This is so a lot of times skeptics will say, there's no way something like this can float. And so we had an engineer who actually came up with this overall design for the ark. His name's Tim Lovett from Australia, and he worked with some naval engineers to talk about, how ships should be built and everything. And he figured out if we built the hull like this, in fact, he came here to build this cross section. So if the whole thing was built like this, yes, it would float. But of course, the purpose of our ark is not to float. We have this big hole right here that we just walked through. It's to bring in 8,000 to 10,000 people a day.
So you think that the whole ark was built with this thick?
Possibly. Now the outer layers, like the outside 2 layers, are just sacrificial. So if it hits obstructions and breaks off, it's not going to hurt the ship at all. So if it's built like this, then, and there's another view of it, then it would stay afloat.
So it is proven experimentally here.
Yeah, you can run the computer simulations and everything, and that's what Tim Lovett has done. That you can do this. So in this area, we call this first floor show, and we're bringing people into the ark. It's kind of a glorified queue line because some days the line can go all the way back outside, and so we want to be able to bring a bunch of people in. These cages are our philosophy with how the animals could be taken care of is to work smarter, not harder. So in this case, the sides are out of bamboo, the bottom is made out of bamboo. And so if an animal is in here, uses the bathroom, it will drop down onto this ramp and then drop all the way down here. All you have to do is clean out the bottom.
Oh, wow.
You don't have to open it up and clean out the cage. It's already going to be taken care of itself, and you let gravity do most of the work. and then
Did someone ever tried to keep animals in this kind of cages?
we didn't bring them in this one, but that kind of testing has been done. Yes.
Really?
Yep. Yeah. So there was a study that was done in the 1990s by a guy named John Woodmarap, he had a book called Noah's Ark, a feasibility study, and he used a lot of techniques that were done in the 1800s by farmers to care for animals, and shows how you can do this.
Okay. So there is is there any explanation or any scientific studies in terms of how many engineers and how much preparation work should be done before the Ark was built? We know that it took about 100 years.
Oh, for Noah to build his ark?
Yeah.
Yeah, what we say here is it probably took him a maximum of 50 to 75 years.
50 to 75.
So when it tells us when Noah, in Genesis 5:32, when Noah was 500 years old, he begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So his oldest son was born at 500. The flood comes when he's 600, so you have a 100-year window.
Yeah.
And then when God tells Noah to build the ark, he says it's going to be for you, your wife, your sons, and your son's wife with you. So it sounds like the boys are already married at that time. So how long does that take for the three of them to be born, grow up, and marry? Maybe 25 to 50 years. You subtract that from the 100, and you have a build time of 50 to 75.
But he may start already preparational work in terms of engineering and all of that.
That's possible. So one of the ideas that we had here at the Ark is the Bible never tells us what Noah's profession, his occupation was before the flood.
Yeah.
What if he was already a shipbuilder?
Yeah.
So that when God said Noah build the ark, he said, yeah, I can do that. How big? Okay, that's going to take a while.
It's big.
Because what we've noticed is that as Christians, a lot of us can look back on our life and see how God has been preparing us for years to do the job that He called us to do. And why wouldn't that be the case with Noah? So a lot of people think, oh, you have somebody who had no idea what he's doing, building the most important ship of all time. I don't think so. I think you have somebody who knows what he's doing what God has called him to do. And even if he wasn't a great shipbuilder, he could hire people who were. And so you still have people who know what they're doing building.
Is there any idea about the level of civilization before the flood?
So we know they were capable of working with metal. Genesis 4:22 says Tubal-Cain was an instructor of all kinds of bronze and iron. We know they had musical instruments. We know they were able to build the ark, so they obviously worked with wood. They were intelligent people. If you live up to 900 years, you could do a lot of study and learn a lot of things. But we don't think that they were flying around in airplanes. We don't think that they had nuclear-powered subs, things that are going to help them survive the flood. That's not going to happen. So the way we depict it here at the Ark is maybe similar to like the ancient Romans or the ancient Greeks, where you can build large ships, you can work with metal. You have a society with laws, but it's also very decadent, very wicked. So.
All right.
That's kind of how we show it here at the Ark. So these cages I was mentioning before, you have your water and your food. So with most of the animals, 85% of them are smaller than a medium-sized dog, about 10 kilograms. 85% are smaller than that. So most of them can stay in cages like this or even smaller. And you only have to feed some of them like once a week. So people say, how could you feed nearly 7,000 animals and care for those every day? Well, most of them don't have to be cared for every day. A lot of them you can just leave to themselves. You feed them like a gerbil or a hamster. You feed it once a week and it's good to go. So we show a lot of different water and oil vessels on the side. So the ones that are wider like this, we think would have been for potable water or even for oil lamps. And then ones that are taller and skinnier like that, the amphora, those would be used more for grain. And then you can actually put a cork on the top and put a wax seal. So if any animals like a rat or something get out of their cage, they can't break into the food. So here we have Noah and his family at the Ark, or inside the Ark, they're praying. So this is Noah and his family in a prayer scene. We see each family member once per floor. This is the only time they're all together. And one of the things we wanted to do is we want to reinforce the idea that every single one of us, we're all related. We all go back to Noah and his wife. And so when you look at the family, we should be able to see something of ourselves in that family, as far as the way that human beings look around the world. So we should see some diversity there, but because Noah's three sons are brothers, they're probably going to look kind of similar. So most of the diversity is probably going to come in their wives. And so that's what you notice when you look at the three younger women that are there. You're going to see some diversity so that everybody in the world should be able to see themselves in here in some way. And it's important for us to teach that according to the Bible, we all go back to Noah, and before that we go back to Adam and Eve, meaning that we really are all one blood, one human race. So from a biblical perspective, there is zero basis for racism. And yet some people have twisted the Bible, tried to say, well, this is where you get these ideas from, but that's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches we are all human beings, all made in God's image, and we all have the same problem, sin, and we all have the same solution, the Lord Jesus Christ, who died for all of us, not just people who look a certain way. And so that's one of the things we want to reinforce when we bring people through the Ark. Okay. Yeah, so in this area we're teaching about the animal kinds, and I'll explain. So the Bible tells us that Noah was supposed to bring 2 of every kind on board the Ark, and then 7 pairs of the clean animals and the flying creatures. So in this big open area we start to explain what that concept means. So a lot of times skeptics have said, you know, how can you fit 1 million species or 8 million species or 20 million species? And they just kind of make up these numbers. He doesn't have to. When they throw those, when skeptics use those numbers, they're talking about all the marine creatures. They're talking about all the insects and other bugs and creepy crawly things. Noah probably doesn't have to bring those on board the Ark. They can survive a flood. Okay. So he just has to bring the land-dependent animals, in whose nostrils is the breath of life.
Just one of a kind.
Just 2 of each kind, or 7 or 14 of each kind. There's debate about whether it's 7 or 14. We used 14. So anytime we had a decision between a low number and a higher number, we always went with the higher number to make it harder to fit them on the Ark. Okay. If we always picked a lower number, then somebody's going to say, well, you cheated. And so if the higher number fits, obviously the lower number fits.
So someone actually counted.
Yes. We have a list.
Number of animals.
Yep.
And counted space and determined how much space they will take and where they will fit.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, we have all that down on the other end of the Ark. Okay. But one of the things I'll walk you through here real quickly, just to kind of make sure you look up when you're right in the middle here. Right here, look. And just how big it is. This is one of the good places to look at it.
Yeah, it's huge.
So these large round timbers are the ones that I said were Engelmann spruce. These ones are Douglas fir, the squared timbers. We're walking on bamboo, and then the outside was radiata pine.
So remind me, where did you...
So these ones I think came from Utah. They were out west. They were the dead standing forest where these came from. And they were milled in Colorado. So we had to, all of the CNC cutting for all the holes and everything had to be done out in Colorado. Then they brought all the pieces here and laid them on the ground where the lake is right now. We let them sit there for 3 weeks so they could acclimate to the humidity. And we had if you understand what this means, you had a 1/32 of an inch tolerance where the holes could be. Every single one of them fit.
Oh, really?
Which is kind of a small miracle in and of itself. It shows how accurate the machine was in Colorado, and that the wood didn't warp too much when it was laid out. So that's what these timbers are.
How many of those here?
How many?
How many of those?
I think it's 64. 6 of these ones. It might be 54. We have a sign up on deck 2 that shows the numbers, and I can point that out. And maybe it's on deck 3. I'll point it out, and then you can film that. So here we're showing how they can care for some of the animals. We're showing which animals had to be brought on board the Ark. So some of the animals that people never consider needed to be on the Ark because they think, oh, they've been extinct for millions of years. But the Bible tells us they were made on day 6, the same day as man. So things like dinosaurs and synapsids and some other, what some people think of as prehistoric creatures. We don't really use that word, prehistoric, because man has been around since day 6. So there's not really prehistory. So that's showing, these are showing some of the animals that would have needed to be on the Ark from our view and how they could be cared for. One of the things I mentioned before, he doesn't have to bring the insects or anything. He doesn't have to bring the plants. He doesn't have to bring the sea creatures. So when they throw out the numbers out there, like millions and millions of animals, all of that gets reduced to about 40,000 species.
40,000.
But that's the species. Okay. He doesn't have to bring 40,000 species. He has to bring the kinds. So a coyote and a wolf and a dingo are all different species, but they're of dogs. Okay. So he just needs 2 dogs. Okay. And when you start to understand that concept, he just needs 2 cats, not 33 species of cats. Yeah. And then when you start to understand it, then you understand how they can fit on board the Ark. Yeah. So let's head down over this way. When we have skeptics coming through, we have to remind them that Noah didn't have to bring the marine creature because they always will put that in their count. How do you fit these millions of species? And he doesn't have to bring this, not 2 of every species. He just bring 2 members of that kind, and they don't have to be the biggest ones. They can be the juveniles.
So, okay.
In fact, that makes a lot of sense. Juveniles
Yeah.
would eat less, they take up less space, they have less waste, so you don't have to clean up as much.
Yeah.
They're more durable. You know, because I'm
Yeah.
older, I'm getting close to
Yeah.
50. If I
Yeah.
fall over, I break.
Yeah.
But a young one
Yeah.
can bounce right back up.
Yeah.
And after the flood, they're going to have more years to reproduce.
Okay.
You don't bring the oldest that can't have babies anymore. So it makes a lot of sense to bring the juveniles.
So yeah.
So to talk about that kind and species issue, and how we figured out the number that we brought on board the Ark, the bats are a good example of that. So this is our bat cave.
Okay.
There are 18 different families of bats in the world today, and we strongly suspect they all belong to the same kind. But we didn't have all the data that we needed to prove that, you know, whether they can all interbreed. So even though we suspect they belong to the same kind, we had to split them out into different kinds. And there's also 5 or 6 extinct families of bats. So we have 24 different kinds of bats on board the Ark, and because they're flying creatures, we have 14 of each. So we have over 300 bats on the Ark. Noah might have just needed 7. So that shows how we are likely overestimating the number. When we say we have almost 6,800 animals, we're probably overestimating by quite a bit. So the real number might be closer to about 4,000, or maybe 4,500. But 67 or 6,800 can fit on board the Ark. The lower number obviously can fit. So what we're walking around in right now is what we call the Ark Encounter. Of course, this huge ramp that's here is built for wheelchairs and the electric vehicles.
Scooters, yeah.
Noah didn't have to have that, so
Yeah.
his floor space wasn't taken up with a huge ramp like
Yeah,
this. So we built a model that has a cutaway, so it's a cross-section of the Ark, where we think this makes a lot more sense to design the Ark's interior like this.
Okay.
So what you see in this model is not the same as what we're walking around in. This is built to show how the
How it
animals, the
could be.
cargo, everything can fit, whereas this is designed for 8,000 visitors a day. And
Okay.
I mentioned the list of all the animals, that's over there on that side, and they're broken up by the type of creature and how many of each one was required, and then also some of the different cargo needs. So the total number of animal kinds that we came up with when we went through all of the studies, you have fewer than 1,400, so 1,398.
Okay.
But remember I talked about how we split the bats out into 24 different kinds and it's probably just one? That number can probably come down quite a bit. So,
Okay. So what can you explain us about this model? What's the most interesting about
so
it?
one thing to notice that's very different, I mentioned the ramp here.
Yeah,
You don't see that in here because you could have short ramps that go like these
Yeah,
ones.
stairways.
Yeah, there could be stairways or even ramps for the animals. So if Noah's going to load the animals on the Ark, to me it makes the most sense to have the door on the second deck, and then you have a ramp that goes up to that, and from there you can go down or up. So you don't need so much of the floor space. So that's the first thing that stands out to me. One thing that we think makes more sense is the living quarters maybe on deck 2.
Okay.
If you're on the ship, you're not going to rock as badly if you're in the middle. You're closer to all the animals. Here in the Ark itself, we have the living quarters on deck 3, but that's just for the purpose of telling the narrative as you go through. That's just where it fit best. But we think it makes more sense for them to be on deck 2. But you can see a lot of the different cages that we're going to see on deck 2. You can see some of the different storage units that we already saw.
We just passed,
and
yeah.
those would have been for amphibians or reptiles. So.
Yeah, what can you tell us about this?
So this shows a lot of the calculations that people can
numbers
understand. I mentioned earlier how 85% of the animals are 10 kilograms or less. That's
Okay.
fully grown of the types of animals need to be
Okay.
on. So usually when people think of how could you fit all the, they just think of like a giraffe and an elephant and think you can't fit, you know, this many huge animals in
Yeah.
there. Well, most of them are tiny. Most birds weigh barely anything.
And even those who are huge, they could be babies.
Yeah, you bring the babies or
Yeah.
juveniles, yep.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense to do that. This shows how 8 people can take care of all the work that needs to be done. Shows you how large the Ark is compared to like the Titanic or the Statue of Liberty. So it just gives you an idea of how they could do all these things. So for example, how do you get fresh water on the Ark? So we have a video up on the second deck that kind of walks people through that. If we use the roof of the Ark to collect rainwater, they would need 1 inch of water every week during the flood to have enough water to care for everything. Well, during the flood, you're going to have more than 1 inch of water a week. In fact, 1 inch per week is what we average here in Kentucky during the year. So you just need as much rain as what we get in Kentucky. So what we did in our calculations is you start with 3 months worth of potable water, and then use the roof to collect rainwater. Whether or not that's how they did it, we don't know, but it shows how feasible it is.
Yeah, it is possible.
So that's what this sign is meant to convey. We've got other signage over there just talking about the size of the ark and about the cubit that I mentioned before.
What about food? How could they provide food for a year-long expedition?
Yeah, so the Bible tells us that God told Noah to bring all food that's eaten. It's going to be for you and for the animals. So a lot of times people will say, well, sometimes Christians will say, well, the animals just hibernated during the flood. That's not our expectation because God said to bring food for them. So we don't think that God put them into hibernation or anything like that. They probably were sluggish like a lot of animals are during a storm, so they probably weren't eating as much, they're not as active. But so since Noah was told to bring all food that's eaten, I would think they would have had a lot of grains that can keep for a long time, or nuts and other things. Probably not a lot of fresh fruit, maybe right at the very beginning, but not for very long. Same with vegetables. But you could bring a lot of the grains or other things that would keep. And so that's what we represent in some of the storage.
Was it calculated how much food would be
So we've got
needed
15,000, roughly 400 tons of food. And so our guys went through with a list of all 1,400 kinds, 6,700 animals, how much they eat, how much the 8 people are going to eat, and then did all the calculations to figure out the details that you've got here.
Okay. And it is proven that this number of tons will fit here?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, everything fits in here just fine. When I say just fine, it fits just right, kind of like Goldilocks. It's not too big, it's not too small, it's just right, which that's what we would expect. God told Noah how big to build the ark. So it's not going to be way too big where Noah's spending years and years of his life building something unnecessary, or too small so that when they're trying to load the animal, they think, well, we can't fit these ones. So everything's going to fit the right way. And that's what we discovered as we were doing this. So.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Very interesting.
All right, so there's a shot of all the different animal kinds that were required, and as I mentioned before, so far nobody said, hey, you forgot this one.
So actually there are people who went kind by kind of animals, and they determined how many exact should be here.
So we have on our Answers Research Journal, and we sell a couple of books that cover these as well, how the rationale used or the criteria used to determine what's a kind. If animals can interbreed, they belong in the same kind. And then you can also look at anatomy, and also for some of them you can look at genetic studies and to help determine which belong in the same kind. If there was any question about that where we couldn't prove it, we put them in different kinds so that we're being, would you say that's liberal counting? It's probably too high of a counting?
Counting all of them.
So it's roughly equivalent to the family level in our classification system, but it's not always at that level.
Okay.
But that's an approximation that people can think about it that way. So rather than species, think family, and that'll help you understand which animals are required. So over here we have comparisons between Noah's Ark and our Ark, and then in between we also do some teaching about why the Ark is designed the way that it is. And the typical Ark that people see, like the rectangular box one, that can float. The problem is it gets turned side on into the waves, and so the waves will hit the side the entire time, and you will be doing this the entire time, which would be miserable. So because we have on ours what we call this bow fin up on when we were coming toward the Ark, it's on the left side, and then the stern projection, which is that thing that sticks out on the bottom. On modern ships, they look like what's called a bulbous bow. So if people think the bow is on that end, it's actually on this end because there's no propulsion in the Ark. So the Ark would get carried by the wind and the waves, and this actually becomes the front. So what those things do is it forces the Ark to, because of the wind and the waves, to turn into the waves, and then it rides over the waves as it's being pushed along. So it's not rocking side to side, it's cutting through the waves the way it's supposed to. So there was a lot of thought that went into the engineering of this and how you would design something to do that.
So this thing actually will float?
Not this one, because we have like the emergency exit stairs over there.
Let's say.
But if it was built with the hull, like we saw back there, or like we see right here and here, yes, then it would float.
Okay. All right. Is there any historical evidences that there were ships
close to the size?
No, not the size, but the idea.
Oh, that looked similar to this? So I think one of the things that Tim Lovett, the engineer who did this, He noticed on a lot of the ancient Greek, I think they're called triremes, that they had this little projection on the front, and then they also had some of these ideas, not to that extreme, not to that size, but they weren't building ships as large as this either. Okay. And so I think he got inspiration from those ancient shipbuilding techniques, including the same what's called trunnels here, or this mortise and tenon planking, where it's overlapping planking held together by these trunnels, which when they get wet they expand and seal it, make it waterproof and immovable. So, so all of that was designed by looking at how the ancient Greeks built their ships.
Are there any ideas what is the oldest known ship that had been excavated?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know. I know there's one in Israel called the Jesus boat that's about 2,000 years old, but I think we have some that are older than that. I got to see that one a year ago in right by the Sea of Galilee. They have a little museum there. But I think there are older ones than that. So I'm not quite sure. Good question.
All right.
I'll have to ask a ship historian.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting for me. You know, is there any historical traces that people were building ships, and how far it goes?
Right. Yeah, we know. I mean, even looking at ancient Greek myths or stories, you have like the Odyssey, which is supposed to take place after the Battle of Troy, so 13th century BC. 13th century. So you have large ships that are crossing the Mediterranean at that time. I'm not saying everything in the Odyssey is true, but they're not making up the idea of ships. So they go back at least that far, and even the Egyptians, you know, traveling the Nile and other things. So you have large vessels that date far back. So one of the things to keep in mind when we're talking about the biblical account of the flood, Noah is building the ark at the peak of his society's technological capabilities, most likely. And then once the flood happens, all of that technology is wiped out except for what's on the ark. And so the people kind of have to start over, and they start to build back again, but instead they're at Babel, and people are rebelling, and God forces them to scatter. So all the technology that was there is starting over again. So most of what we see when we look back at ancient civilization, we're seeing what's happening shortly after Babel. And so we get this idea that people are Stone Age, that they're primitive, but no, you're looking at it after 2 technological resets, and people are just starting over. If you were able to go back a little bit further, you would see that they had a higher technological capability than most people imagine, because people are ingenious. You know, shortly after Babel, they're building the Great Pyramid, they're building Stonehenge, and we look at that today and think, how did they do this? Because people are smart, and they figure out ways to accomplish things that somebody like me, I could never figure out.
All right.
And just how large the ark is. So when we get to the middle here and turn, we're nearly at the halfway point of the ark, and you can take a look back and see just how far it extends. So some people will stop right here and that's what the little footprints are. You can stand here and take a picture, and then when we're right up
about half.
So when we're right up above us, we have a sign that says how far it is from this point to the end. I think this one is 252 feet, and then when you're on that side to the end, it's 240 feet. There's 18 feet in between. And if I did my math right, we're at 510 feet, but I think I did it. The numbers are right up there, and we can double check that. So deck 1 was meant to be an introduction for people to help understand the animal kinds issue. We're going to do more teaching on deck 2 about that. Because that's a big question so many people have. How can you fit all these animals in the ark? Skeptics will say that, you know, we hear that all the time. So we want to help them understand, 1, how big the ark is, and 2, how many animals. Usually they don't know the answer to either one of those questions, so we got to help them along with that.
So it's possible to build such a huge ship, and it is possible to fit all the animals that are.
That's what we wanted to show.
Supposed to be.
So we still have a little bit of work to do to help people understand the biblical message to get up to the flood. So we have what's called the pre-flood world exhibit. This used to always all be down in one exhibit there, but the line would back all the way up down to the first deck and wrap around. And so in order to alleviate the traffic, we split this into 2 exhibits. So this is the perfect world. This is the 6 days of creation, and God rested on the 7th day. And then we want people to imagine what it would be like to be in a world where there is no death, suffering, or disease. It's very hard to even imagine, because everything we know is suffering from the curse itself. And so you have everything we know breaks down. Everything we know eventually dies. And yet the Bible tells us originally that's not how it was supposed to be. So trying to picture what that perfect world would be like, what that first marriage would have been like. It would have been perfect originally until they rebelled. And so that's what this exhibit's meant to show. And then when we get to the next one, we're going to see that world break. And when Adam and Eve ate the fruit, and then things got worse and worse to the point of the time of the flood. So that's the next exhibit. And might even have a couple surprises in there for you.
Okay.
The Bible tells us in Genesis 3 that the serpent comes along and tempts Eve to eat the fruit. He tells her, she says that, we're not supposed to eat the fruit. When we do, we're going to die. And he says, you will not surely die. Obviously, that's a lie from our perspective, because God says if you do it, you're going to die. If you contradict that, well, that's false. So here's a depiction of that temptation and of Eve taking the fruit and Adam taking the fruit and eating it. And then as a result, that world breaks. So now we're going to see thorns and thistles in the world, which the Bible says they weren't there before. Now there's going to be death and suffering in the world. And at the same time, God also promised that the serpent one day was going to be crushed. Of course, we believe that's a reference to Satan one day being crushed by the seed of the woman. That's in Genesis 3:15. And ultimately, Jesus will do that and has begun that at the cross. So then after Adam and Eve sinned and after God pronounced the curse and their judgment, the Bible tells us that he made coats of skin for them and clothed them. So here we see, originally they were naked, but there was no shame or anything. Once they sinned, then they recognized that. And so here we depict like the goat sheep kind on the altar. They were skinned, and God makes coats of skins. So we don't know what kind of animals God killed to make those coats of skin. We've always depicted it as like the sheep or a lamb, because it would be a great picture of what's going to come when Jesus Christ, the Lamb of the world, or the Lamb of God, takes on the sins of the world and dies in our place. So it would be a good picture of that, but we're not sure if that's exactly what it was or not. It makes good sense. So then God kicks them out of the garden and prevents them from going back. We mentioned Cain and Abel before. There's a depiction of that. And then in this wall, we're showing how the world over the next 1,600 years or so, 1,500, 1,600 years, descends into darkness. So some of the things that are mentioned in and of themselves are not wrong. So civilization is not wrong. Marriage is not wrong, but over-marriage, polygamy would be wrong. Music in and of itself is not necessarily wrong, but it can be used for bad purposes. So some of these things are just things described in Genesis 4 through Genesis 6 that talk about the overall wickedness. And so we're kind of depicting that for people as we go through. Same thing with metalworking, can be used for good purposes or bad purposes. And then just showing some of the incredible violence before the flood. And so one of the things we want to do is depict that through dioramas. And this is it's my favorite one for a couple of reasons. One, you got a really cool Carnotaurus coming out beside there. Number two, because that guy right there looks pretty handsome to me. Does he look familiar?
Yeah.
It is, yeah. I got the model for that guy.
Oh, really? Really?
So he's built at Goliath scale. If you picture somebody 9'9", about 9 inches taller than the top of my hand, that's how big he would look next to a normal person. And for the record, I'm the good guy. I'm keeping law and order. She's a serial killer. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But I'm the content manager. I get to make up the story for this.
Okay.
But anyways, what we wanted to show is if you think about I talked about the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks. We know like the ancient Romans would take Christians and throw them into the Colosseum where they'd be torn apart by lions or gladiators. And so we thought, well, what could you do in the pre-flood world that would be just as frightening, if not more frightening? So why not something like that? Of course, we don't know if that's what they used, but we know the world was filled with violence, that every thought of man's heart was only evil continually, the Bible tells us, that God was grieved that he had made man. That's how full of violence the world had become. So perhaps this is something that they did, just celebrated the violence this way. But again, it's meant to be, we talk about it here, artistic license or artistic interpretation. From that point, we're envisioning what it might have been like just before the flood, because the Bible didn't give us a lot of detail other than it was really, really wicked. So we show people abusing creation, just like today you have poachers who are killing animals just either for sport or for the horns or whatever, or tusks. Maybe you had something like that going on in the pre-flood world. Some more depiction of violence, some of the decadence taking place before the flood. So it was very tricky for us to do this exhibit because the Bible describes how wicked it was. but we're trying to create a family-friendly attraction.
Yeah.
So if we go too far, we're going to upset everybody. If we don't go far enough, then it makes God look mean or evil because he's judging people who aren't that bad. And yet the Bible tells us the world was extremely violent and wicked. So there's a balancing act that we had to walk here at the ministry.
So it's much more wicked than you can picture.
I think so. So a lot of what we did is did it through implication. So everybody knows what's about to happen to this guy.
Yeah.
You don't have to show it.
Yeah.
And same thing over here. You can see a child being offered to this pagan god, and you see women coming down the steps without their child, but women going up with their children. So adults will understand child sacrifice. Kids maybe not get that if the adults want to explain it. Same thing on the side. It's obviously depicting like temple prostitution. You don't have to open the curtain to show that. Adults will understand, and the kids can, if the parents want to explain it to the kids, they can. So a lot of it is done through implication, and we figured that was probably the safest way to go. And then the Bible tells us that God destroyed that world with a flood, and that only Noah and his family and the animals on board the ark were spared from that flood. Well, as far as land animals go, of course, marine creatures can survive in the water. So that's what this large mural is depicting. And then Jesus actually compared the judgment that happens when he returns. He compared that to the days of Noah and the flood that happened at that time. The flood came and took them all away. They weren't aware of it. Someday Christ is going to return and judge this world, but not with water.
Yeah, talking about judgment and how severe was it. In today's world, the world which is humanistically driven by humanistic philosophies, and it looks like too cruel that God just wiped out the whole earth. How would you explain it from biblical point of view?
So, I missed one word there. You said that it looked like it was too what?
Too cruel.
Too cruel. Okay. Yeah. So skeptics will ask that all the time. Why? In fact, when we opened the Ark on July 7, 2016, we had protesters. Atheist protesters, about 80 to 100 of them at the off ramp, and I went down there and talked to them for about 3 hours, and then I led a tour through the Ark for about an hour and a half, and did a Q&A with them. One of the objections is that God is so cruel in doing this, and the first point is God's the one who makes the world. He creates us, so he has the right to do as he pleases. But he's also a good God. He's a loving God, and he's not going to be cruel or capricious and just do something for no reason at all. He's going to have good reasons for it. So some people say, why a flood? Why not just snuff them out in their sleep so they don't even understand what's going on? Well, a flood would actually give you a few moments to repent. If you see the floodwaters rushing in, you can cry out to God and be saved. It doesn't mean that you're going to go on the ark, but he can forgive you of your sin. So there's that. It would also leave a record that God judges sin. So for all future generations, we're going to see all these fossils that were laid down in sedimentary layers, which means they were laid down by water. So these things leave a record for future generations to know that God is serious about sin and he judges it. So there's two reasons why you can do it with a flood.
Probably one of the major ones is a serious of sin.
Yeah, so that's one of the major ones, is that God is very serious about sin. One sin, and Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden, and death and suffering come to this world. One sin, and God sends his son to die on the cross to redeem humanity. So in our world, we don't think of sin as a big deal because we're so used to it. We all commit sin, and we are all guilty of sinning against God. And so we try to make light of it, but because God is holy, he's perfectly holy, then sin is it is an affront to a perfectly holy God. Let's see, one other, to answer your previous question about why would God judge the world, the other thing is he's already promised that he's going to send his son to the world, to this seed of the woman who's going to crush the serpent. The Bible tells us before the flood that God tells Noah, I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. That world was so filled with wickedness that if God doesn't destroy that, then that line to the Savior is also going to be stopped or obliterated, and God's not going to fulfill his promise. And so to redeem humanity, sometimes he has to make drastic moves, and the flood would be probably the number one of those drastic moves. So.
All right.
But it's not as if the people were innocent. We tend to picture it as just people
so it
who were...
shows how bad the sin is.
Right. So now we're depicting some of the larger animals in some cages, and we were strategic in which animals that we picked. Obviously, we're not showing every single animal because the amount of time it would take to sculpt 1,400 kinds of animals would be enormous. We'd still be working on them because our guys take a lot of time and care with every single one that they make. So this one is a Pakicetus. You may remember from our biology textbooks, these are considered to be early whales. The evolutionists would tell us that you had this land creature, something like a Masonic or something that would kind of looked more like a wolf, would go back into the water and grow flippers and everything else. And they built, originally, Pakicetus was one of those so-called missing links. They built it off a little tiny fragment of a lower jawbone and a little tiny inner ear bone, and they said this is a creature that used to be on land and now going around in the water. But we've found more fossils. It had 4 legs. It does seem to be a creature that dwelled near the water, and it's got longer legs, so maybe it stood in the shallow water and ate fish or something. We're not really sure because we don't see its behavior. But it's not something becoming a whale. It's a unique kind, and that's what we find in all these cases. So the evolutionists a lot of times will attach a story to the fossil. They already have this idea in their mind. Here's what happened, and they find a fossil and try to fit that into their story. And so the best evidence for evolution is in the storytelling and in the artwork. It's not from the fossil itself. So this tells you some more, shows some more of the creatures that would have been on the Ark. We picked a mixture of those that are extinct, about 50% that are now extinct and 50% that are still around today, to help people get a better idea of what animals would have been on the Ark. So then we have a theater here that is showing a short film. It's Noah being interviewed before the flood by a tabloid, a skeptical reporter, and he's explaining why he built the Ark because God told him to. And then on the top deck, we have the same actors and actors playing a similar role in modern day. People coming here and asking one of our Noah why the Ark was being built, and it's an opportunity to share the gospel. So we have an exhibit here for children or for big children like us, people who to go through and just enjoy little jump scares and other things. The idea behind this is what would happen if the animals got out at night, and so kids can go in there and have a little bit of fun time. We'll skip it on our tour. We got Shem's wife up here, so once again we're going to see each member of the family once per deck, and in this level we're going to see all 8 of them in this row somewhere or in the exhibits, and they're usually involved in some sort of work on this level. We're showing on deck 2 how they could care for the animals they needed to, how they could take care of daily life. So let me show you the giraffe kind. It may look a little different to you because modern giraffes have a really long neck. Now, creationists and evolutionists agree that the giraffe and the okapi, which is look kind of like a horse, but then it has like zebra stripes on the back leg. The creationists and evolutionists agree those things are related. They belong in the same, we would say kind, they would say in the same family, I think it is. And what we found in the fossil layers, not just the regular giraffe, we also found like Chancetheria, this one, that has 4 ossicones, or 2 dual-branched ossicones rather than just the 2 that we see on modern giraffes. A shorter neck like an okapi. So this fossil is found in China. And so what we did when we built the animals, it wasn't just take a giraffe and okapi and mix them. It was, let's find the lowest giraffe fossil that we can find in the fossil layers closest to what we think is the flood boundary. So find the lowest fossil, and if you have a good representative fossil of that kind, then we'll use that and we're going to make that. So that's the lowest giraffe that we find in the fossil record with a good fossil representation. We find other ones that have antlers almost like moose that we think belong in the giraffe kind. So they're very diverse, and this is a good teaching point for how the scientific methodology behind how we sculpt the animals and why they look the way that they do in the Ark. So this exhibit deals with the animal kinds and shows how you can go from the 1,400 kinds up to the 40,000 species of land animal that we see that have been identified. There's about 34,000 today, 6,000 have gone extinct. But how you can get up to the ones that we see today. And we've already talked about that process, so you just bring 2 cats like you see there. That would be one of the lowest cats in the fossil layers, this Prolaris. And from that, you get all the different cats we see in the world, from your common house cat up to the lion or the tiger, they're all related. So creationists, evolutionists agree on that point. They would just say it takes hundreds of thousands or millions of years for those creatures to evolve. This is the exact opposite of evolution, and it's such an important point because so many times people say, oh, you believe in like super fast evolution. No, this is the opposite. You're taking an animal that already has the genetic diversity and you're breeding that out or natural selection, depending on where they go. Certain creatures will survive and pass on those genes.
Yeah, the key difference is, as I understand, between the evolutional way of model, how different species or different kinds of being developed, that the information is being added to, but when
through mutations or something else.
It's the other way around. So
right.
The whole information originally was like in two pair of cats, and then you subscribe some of information and you have smaller cats or bigger cats.
Right. So when you look at the common house cat today, you can't keep breeding those and get a lion.
Yeah.
But if you could breed that with something that's a little bit bigger, and then maybe with a bobcat, and then with something that you can get back some of the genetic diversity. But so even like the cheetah right now is very endangered because it's so inbred. We call these creatures like purebreds, but they're actually inbred so much they've lost so much genetic diversity. They're very specialized at what they do, but they're not healthy as a result in many cases. So same thing with purebred dogs. They have to go to the vet all the time. But if you take a mutt, one that has all of the a lot of the genetic diversity, it's very strong. It can survive a lot of things. It doesn't have to go to the vet all the time. So it's the opposite. So we're saying it already had the genetic information, and then each, as it speciates, goes to different regions and cut off from other ones, it's losing genetic information. So it's the opposite of evolution. It's what we observe in the world, where the evolutionists, we've never, ever observed one kind of creature gaining new genetic information that could turn one kind of creature into another. That's never been observed. What we're talking about has been observed regularly. So this fits, observable science. Their model does not. So that's what we teach in this exhibit. Then we use the dog as the example because most people are familiar with dogs. And so we show after the flood, we see in the fossil record dogs that are capable of doing all sorts of variety of things, even tree climbing dogs. And so originally we don't think that they were domesticated, but at some point some dogs did become domestic, and then you also have wild dogs as well. And then here we're just showing some of the differences between the biblical creation model and the naturalistic evolutionary model. So we have a logo that you'll see here and in several exhibits on deck 3 where to remind people we're seeing the same world. We study the same fossils, the same plants, the same animals, we see the same thing. But we reach different conclusions because we have different starting points. We start with God's word that tells us He made everything in 6 days, and you would have 2 people with the genetic information for all the people we see today. Same thing with the animals. Not just 2 of each kind of animal that was created, you would have had more, but at the Ark you would have 2 of each kind. And then the naturalistic model said no, those things spontaneously came into life, just one-celled organism, and from that you get all of what we see today. Things that we've never observed anything like that. So drastic differences between the two, and sadly there are a lot of Christians who will claim this and then just take this model and try to stick that on top of the Bible, and they don't understand that this model was developed to try to explain life apart from God. So when they do that, they're forcing all sorts of problems into the Bible, such as death and suffering and disease for billions of years before Adam and Eve.
Looking at this, comparing these 2 views, what would you say the weakest point of naturalistic evolution?
Well, I think they're all weak, but in one sense, the whole idea of life coming from non-life, how do you get DNA, this genetic code, and the language that reads that code, so much information packed into that one molecule, where does that come from? From a naturalistic perspective. So we've never observed life come from non-life, information from non-information, intelligence from non-intelligence, and yet they think all that happened just by chance, and then continue to develop to get smarter and smarter.
So the information probably is the main
I think that, and
that makes it absolutely impossible.
I believe so.
And it's very organized and very complex information that we see in DNA. Which is it just requires mind or someone to produce this.
Yes, because if you looked at a book,
Yeah.
You would never look at that and say, oh, that just randomly came together, you know, by a typewriter or something like that, just being there.
And any book you take is much, much more simpler than
Yes.
DNA.
Yeah, DNA would be so much more complex than any book that we have in the world today. Except for maybe the tax code that's like...
How does this model relate to humans? You know, obviously we didn't split into anything after the flood.
Yes.
Do you guys have these questions asked?
So how do they relate to humans?
Yeah.
So humanity would be
We
similar.
stayed the same, essentially. after
Yeah,
the flood.
well, and so do, if you think about it, the great apes stay the same. They're still just all great apes.
Right.
They're just diversity within that great ape kind. Humans, there's diversity within humans, obviously tall and short, and you know, whether it's
Smart and not very smart.
I like how he looked at you for that one. But I mean, what we usually do, a lot of times we've been trained in our culture to look at skin color.
Yeah.
We say, oh, darker or lighter, different races. Like, oh, but we also have variation in height, variation in eye color, variation in hair color or lack of hair. We have all sorts of variety, and yet we know through the Human Genome Project, we're all human.
Right.
Those outside differences that we look at and make such a big deal about are so minor when it comes to the different changes, the whole amount of genetic complexity within humanity. And to me, it just shows that God's creativity, the diversity there. So every human being, from when you want to look at from the tallest person to the shortest, or from the very darkest person skin tone to the very lightest person, all made in God's image, all go back to Noah and his wife, and they're also very obviously human. And they need to be treated with dignity and respect because they're human beings made in God's image. So, yeah.
All right.
And that's very different than the evolutionary model as well,
Yeah,
because from an
yeah.
evolutionary perspective, we've evolved from ape-like ancestors,
Yeah.
and some humans would be more closely related to the apes than others. And so they would have us, for a long time, they actually broke out the different so-called races and they ranked them, and that fueled racism. I'm not saying it started
Yeah,
racism,
yeah,
people have
yeah,
been
but it
racist,
fuels, yeah.
but it fuels it. And
It
you'll have
gives,
evolutionists like Stephen Jay Gould admit
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
It's not just creationists who are saying that. So this exhibit shows some of the cages that we've seen and gives helps explain how those would work and how the animals would be fed and how they get their water, how the family could do repairs. You saw some of these down on the deck one, so this gives you a cutaway view of that. So this would be for like an amphibian or a reptile in the pot, and if you can pour water through the top. You can have a moth bin or a moth crib in the back that feeds that, so they can fly into there and think they're going to the light, but they're actually going to be food. So that's just one possible mechanism that they used. We don't know if they did, but that was just an ingenious way of working smarter, not harder. So one fun detail for the kids, if you look on the signage here, you'll notice some handwriting there, and also on that side. If we were to give you a little decoder, you can actually go through and try to figure out what that is. It's actually, we call it Noah language. It's really written in English right to left, with another character for a space, so you can decode everything. A lot of times it's a message from one family member to another, so as they come in and do the work, they're explaining things. So you'll see that throughout Deck 2, and there might be some in Deck 3. I think it's just Deck 2. So we also talk about how some of the unique creatures with unique diets could have been fed. So the skeptics will say, how could you take care of these animals on board the Ark? But they're looking at modern representatives that have become so overly specialized rather than something that's more robust prior to the flood or at the time of the flood. So I mentioned before how they could collect rainwater, get rid of the waste. That's what this animation shows. One possible mechanism for ventilating the Ark to get enough airflow.
Yeah, what about the ventilation? How
So
would it work?
the study that I mentioned earlier, the feasibility study from the 1990s, showed that if you have an 18-inch window along the top, which the Bible talks about finishing it to a cubit from above, so an 18-inch window, just by that alone, you would have enough ventilation circulating through the Ark. One of the mechanisms we proposed, we don't know if they did this, but we used what's called a moon pool. So some of the diving vessels will have this well on the bottom where it's open on the bottom. And as long as the well itself, the walls of it, are lower than what the water levels are going to be, then you can actually, or I mean it's higher than the water level is going to be, yes. Otherwise you're going to sink. But then you can have an opening in the Ark to the...
It would pull the air.
So it would be like a
inside and
piston.
push.
It would pull and then push it up with the wave and pump it out through the thing. So we don't know if they did that, but that's one possible.
It is possible. So it would just...
Yeah, so it kind of works as a piston to pump it through there. I think that would provide a lot of fresh air.
Yeah.
And then we also talk about different ways to light the ark. Remember, the Bible mentions this opening, this 18-inch window at the top. Oh, just lost it. We also have oil lamps that you see, so that's one mechanism. And then the Bible also mentioned Noah removing the covering of the ark toward the end of the flood. We don't know what that is because the Bible doesn't tell us what that is. So we picture it as like the very top just having this opening that he could have pulled off. But it could have been something very different. Maybe the top was covered with like animal skins, and then it would actually provide a little bit of natural light. It'd be, just coming through there, but not a lot of light, but a little bit. So that's one possibility. We're not exactly sure what it means when it says he removed the covering. It's just mentioned one time, and the Bible doesn't always set out to tell us everything that we want to know. It tells us what we need to know, but then we have so many questions, and sometimes we're left to speculate a little bit. So what we see in the ark, if the Bible describes it, we're going to put it in there, and then some of the things we're left to speculate about. So here we have Noah answering 14 different questions that people have, and you can touch the little screen there, and he'll answer those questions for you. But sometimes we have to speculate about it. We don't know the name of his wife. Well, we named her. We don't know the names of the other women on the ark, but we named them because we want people to understand these were real people who went through real times and through a real event. And so it helps personalize them, but we don't know what their names were. So we have signs throughout the ark talking about artistic license, and we're not trying to add to the Bible. We're just trying to help make sense of what we read.
Just to imagine how it could be.
Yes.
Yeah,
so
and
here,
it's good. It's good because it shows that it's real. It's not just myth.
Right.
With just main idea with all the details.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that on the third deck right above us. We have an exhibit called Flood Legends, where there are hundreds of legends from around the world, where so many of them are very clearly myth. But when we look at the biblical account, we're going to see that it's very unique in many ways. So here we've got a wood shop. We know they could work with wood. Here we've got the forge or blacksmith area. We know that they could work with metal as well. Earlier I talked about this idea that maybe Noah was already a shipbuilder. So that's where this idea, or this exhibit is, I was asked to write a backstory for Noah, how he could have acquired the skills that he obviously had to build the ark. And so I came up with this storyline. And when you look at the exhibit itself, anything that looks like parchment, that's right from the Bible. Anything else is the artistic license, whether it's describing his world or what he was doing at that time. So the whole idea of him being a shipbuilder, that I came up with it for this exhibit, and then several people said, "Oh, that's a fun idea. You should write novels." At first, I didn't want to, but I actually did end up writing some novels that kind of follow this storyline, and they're kind of the official backstory for Noah's family here at the Ark.
Where we can buy them?
They're here at the Ark. We don't have them in Russian, but we do have them in English.
Yeah, but at least in English. Yeah, that would be good. We have actually good bookstore.
Okay.
In our church, so we could get them from a publisher.
Okay.
And
Yeah, we sell them here at the bookstore, and then they'll be available through Master Books. one exhibit that I think confuses a lot of people is this one's called the Fairy Tale Ark. And everybody, so many people in our world think of Noah's Ark as being something like this, this little bathtub toy, fun children's thing. But if you think about it, if the Ark looked like that, within the first wave, it's gonna sink, and there aren't gonna be any more people, and no more animals. And so some people will just come in here and look at it and think, oh, look at all these fun books, and then they go to the bookstore and say, can I buy some of those? And I say, no, we're telling you these aren't good. So certainly a lot of the people who did these had good intentions. We want to teach children about the Bible, but when we make it too cute, when we make it too unrealistic, we make it seem like it's a fairy tale. And we aren't helping people understand the reality of the flood event. So that's what this exhibit is designed to do in a somewhat of a lighthearted way, but also serious. That you have to think about it, that it wasn't this. It was because all that tells you is Noah's Ark is a happy bedtime story for kids. It's about a happy old guy and a bunch of cute animals. That's not what the Bible says. The Bible says that all flesh had corrupted its way. The whole world was filled with violence. That every thought of man's heart was only evil continually, and God was grieved that he had made man. That's a very different image than what we see on these things. So we want to help people understand the importance of teaching the Bible faithfully, rather than a stereotype that people have in their minds because of Sunday school stories or whatever else it might be. All right, we're going to go left here. All right, so we're coming up to the door. The Bible tells us that Noah was supposed to build a door in the midst of the ark. And so we put that on deck 2, just above where the water line would get to. So actually what we wanted to do here, the story is that one of his daughters-in-law was getting there used to be an audio for this, and you kind of hear what she's thinking, but it was conflicting with the audio, so we shut it off. But she got too close to the door. It started to remind her of all the people that she lost. Everybody she's ever known, except for the 7 people in the ark with her, are dead. And so think about survivor's guilt, living through something like that. Sometimes people wonder, why would Noah get drunk after the flood? Maybe because he realized every single person he's ever known is dead. And no matter how righteous he is, as a human being who cares about other human beings, that's gonna weigh on you. And so maybe that's why. So what we want to do is deal with that issue of death and suffering a little bit. Obviously, you have entire books that can be written on it. So we just want to introduce that topic to people, help them think about it from the right perspective. God is the one who is in control. He's the one who sets the rules. I know it's not mean for him to judge sin. And if he's provided a means of salvation and you reject it, then what should happen? And if you rebel against him, what should happen? So to help people have that proper understanding and to introduce them to the gospel, which is what we explained at the door, that there was one way into the ark. Now, Noah and his family were not saved eternally because they walked into the ark. They were spared from the physical consequences of the flood. They didn't drown. But it is a picture of what's going to come at some point in the future. God's going to judge the world again, and this time he's provided a means of eternal salvation through his son Jesus Christ, who died on the cross in our place, taking our punishment upon himself for our sin, and then rose again 3 days later and offers salvation to all who believe in him. And so God's provided that means of eternal salvation from our sins and eternal separation from him in a place called the lake of fire. He's provided that to all who believe in his son Jesus Christ. So he doesn't, in one sense, it's not hard. It's not like we have to work for it and earn it. In another sense, it's very difficult because we're prideful and we have to humble ourselves and say, God, I can't do it. You've already done it. Save me. And yet that one little step is so hard for too many people.